I watched from my kitchen window as Karen Caldwell marched down the private path to my boat dock, clipboard in hand, flanked by two other HOA board members like some kind of suburban militia. My coffee mug paused halfway to my lips as I realized they were taking measurements of my dock, the one I had built 3 years ago after months of permits and construction. Something told me this was about to become a problem. I set down my coffee and headed outside, the morning humidity of Lake Martin, Alabama, already making my shirt stick to my back. It was barely 7 in the morning on a Saturday, and here they were, trespassing on my property like they owned the place. Karen looked up as I approached, her perfectly highlighted blonde hair not moving an inch despite the breeze coming off the water. "Good morning, Yates," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "We're just doing our quarterly property assessment. On my private dock." I asked, keeping my voice level. "This isn't HOA property, Karen." She glanced at her clipboard, then back at me with a smile that made my blood pressure rise. "Actually, according to our records, all waterfront access within Lakeside Estates falls under community property guidelines. We've received several complaints from residents who feel they should have access to this dock since it's technically part of the shared waterfront." I stared at her, genuinely stunned. "You cannot be serious. I built this dock with my own money. I have all the permits. It's on my property." "The waterfront is community property," she repeated, tapping her pen against the clipboard. "We're going to need you to remove the private property signs and allow other residents to use this dock. It's only fair." The other two board members nodded along like bobbleheads. I recognized them as Margaret Davis and Patricia Newman, both women who had nothing better to do than make everyone's life miserable through excessive rules and regulations. Our HOA had become increasingly aggressive over the past year since Karen took over as president, but this was beyond anything I had expected. "I'm not removing anything," I said firmly. "This dock is mine. Check the property deed if you don't believe me." Karen's smile turned condescending. "Mr. Anderson, I don't think you understand how HOAs work. When you purchased your property, you agreed to our covenants and bylaws. The waterfront access is shared. We'll be sending you a formal notice, and if you don't comply within 30 days, we'll begin fining you $500 per day." $500, I repeated, my voice rising. "For not sharing my own dock. For violating community guidelines," she corrected. "We've already had 3 families inquire about using your dock for their boats. The Hendersons, the Martins, and the Bishops all feel it's unfair that you have exclusive access to such a large structure when we all share the waterfront." I looked past them at my dock, the one I had designed myself to accommodate my fishing boat and small pontoon. I had spent over $40,000 on the construction, not to mention the hours of planning and coordination with contractors. The idea that these people thought they could just claim it as community property was insane. "Send me your formal notice," I said coldly, "and then expect to hear from my lawyer." Karen's expression didn't change. "That's your right, of course. But I should warn you, fighting the HOA rarely ends well for homeowners. We have significant legal resources at our disposal." They left, and I immediately went back inside to dig out my property documents. I had bought this house 5 years ago, specifically because of the waterfront location. The previous owner, an elderly man named Robert Chen, had been meticulous about his paperwork. I found the deed in my filing cabinet and spread it out on my kitchen table. There it was, clear as day. The property lines extended past the house, through the yard, and included a specific parcel that went right down to the waterline. The dock was built entirely within my property boundaries. There was no ambiguity, no shared waterfront clause. The HOA was either mistaken or deliberately lying. I called my lawyer, David Patterson, who I had used for the house purchase. He answered on the third ring, sounding groggy. "David, it's Yates Anderson. Sorry to call so early, but I have a situation." I explained everything while he listened, occasionally making small sounds of disbelief. When I finished, he was silent for a moment. "They claimed your dock is community property," he asked, his voice now fully alert. "Yes. They're threatening to fine me $500 a day if I don't open it up to other residents." "Do you have your deed handy?" "Looking at it right now." "The property lines are crystal clear. The dock is entirely on my land." David sighed. "This is either gross incompetence or a deliberate attempt at intimidation. HOAs have been getting more aggressive nationwide, but this is particularly brazen. Don't sign anything they send you, don't pay any fines, and forward me all communication. I'll draft a response." "What are my options here?" "Well, if they persist after being shown the deed, we can sue for harassment. We can also file for an injunction preventing them from accessing your property. But let's start with a strongly worded letter showing them the property boundaries. Sometimes that's enough to make them back down." I thanked him and hung up, but I had a sinking feeling this wasn't going to be resolved easily. Karen Caldwell struck me as the type who doubled down when challenged. I had seen her in action at HOA meetings, steamrolling over anyone who disagreed with her proposals. She had implemented a ban on certain paint colors, restricted when people could have visitors park on the street, and even tried to mandate what types of mailboxes were acceptable. Most residents just went along with it to avoid conflict, but I wasn't most residents. The formal notice arrived 3 days later, delivered by certified mail. It was even worse than I had expected. The letter claimed that according to the original development plans from 1998, all waterfront areas within lakeside estates were designated as shared recreational space, and that any structures built on or near the waterfront were subject to community use policies. They gave me 30 days to remove all private signage and provide access to other residents, or face daily fines starting at $500. I scanned the document and emailed it to David, then sat down to do my own research. I pulled up the original development plans for Lakeside Estates from the County Records Office website. It took some digging, but I found them. The plans clearly showed individual lots extending to the waterfront. There was no shared recreational space designation. There was a small community beach area on the opposite end of the development, but that was it. Either Karen had fabricated this claim entirely, or she was working from incorrect information. I suspected the former. David called me back that afternoon. "I've reviewed everything. They don't have a leg to stand on. Your deed supersedes any HOA claims, and the original development plans support your ownership. I'm drafting a response that will include copies of your deed, the development plans, and a survey map showing the property boundaries. I'm also going to include a cease and desist, warning them against trespassing or continued harassment." "How much is this going to cost me?" I asked. "For the initial response and correspondence, probably around $1,500. If it goes to court, we're looking at $10,000 to $20,000, depending on how long it drags out. But honestly, I think once they see the documentation, they'll back off. No judge would side with them on this." "I appreciate it, David. Send me the invoice." The next HOA meeting was in 2 weeks, and I marked it on my calendar. I wanted to confront Karen publicly with the evidence, make it clear to all the residents what was happening. But before that could happen, things escalated. I came home from work on a Thursday evening to find a chain and lock on my dock gate, my private gate on my private property. A laminated sign hung from the chain. "Community property access by permission of HOA board only." I stood there, staring at the lock, feeling my anger build. They had trespassed on my property and physically locked me out of my own dock. My boat was tied up there. My fishing equipment was in the dock box. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was theft and trespassing. I took photos from every angle, then called the police non-emergency line. The dispatcher told me an officer would be out within the hour. While I waited, I called David. "They did what?" he asked, his voice sharp. "Chained and locked my dock. There's a sign saying it's community property and access is controlled by the HOA board. Don't cut the lock. Let the police document everything. This is perfect for our case, actually. They just committed criminal trespass and possibly theft, depending on how the officer interprets it. Take lots of photos, get a police report, and I'll file for an emergency injunction tomorrow morning." Officer James Rodriguez arrived about 45 minutes later. He was a young guy, probably in his late 20s, and he listened carefully as I explained the situation. I showed him the deed, the property survey, and the photos of Karen and her cronies on my dock from the previous Saturday. "So the HOA is claiming they own this dock?" he asked, studying the documents. "Yes, even though the deed clearly shows it's my property. My lawyer sent them a cease and desist letter 3 days ago. This is their response." He walked down to the dock, examined the lock and chain, and took his own photos. "I can file a report for criminal trespass. Do you know who specifically placed this lock here?" "I assume it was Karen Caldwell, the HOA president, or someone acting on her behalf. I'll need to speak with her." "Do you have her contact information?" I pulled up her number on my phone, and Officer Rodriguez called her right there. I could hear her voice through the speaker, syrupy sweet, as she explained that the HOA had every right to secure community property. "Madam, I'm looking at a property deed that shows this dock is on Mr. Anderson's private property," Rodriguez said patiently. "Do you have documentation proving HOA ownership?" There was a pause. "The waterfront is shared space according to our bylaws." "Bylaws don't supersede property deeds, madam. I'm going to need you to come down here and remove this lock, or I'll have to cite you for criminal trespass." "This is ridiculous," Karen snapped, her sweet tone evaporating. "The HOA has authority over all properties within the development. Not over privately owned structures on privately owned land. You can either come remove the lock now, or I'll file charges and Mr. Anderson will have to cut it off himself. Your choice." She hung up. Officer Rodriguez looked at me and shrugged. "I'm filing the report. You're within your rights to remove the lock. I'd recommend getting a locksmith to do it properly so you can preserve it as evidence if this goes to court." "Can you cite her for trespassing?" "I can, but honestly, it'll probably just be a misdemeanor citation and a small fine. It might be better to let your lawyer handle it through civil court. You'll have more leverage there." He was probably right, but I was furious. After he left, I called a 24-hour locksmith and paid an extra $100 to get him out that night. He cut the lock off, and I kept the chain, lock, and sign in a plastic bag for evidence. The next morning, David filed an emergency motion for a temporary restraining order against the HOA, specifically Karen Caldwell, Margaret Davis, and Patricia Newman. The hearing was set for Monday, just 4 days away. That Saturday, I woke up to find someone had spray-painted "selfish" across my garage door in bright red paint. There were no cameras on that side of the house, but I didn't need video to know who was behind it. I filed another police report and added it to the growing documentation of HOA harassment. At the grocery store that afternoon, I ran into Ben Henderson, one of the families Karen had mentioned wanting to use my dock. He looked uncomfortable when he saw me. "Yates, hey," he said awkwardly. "I heard about the situation with your dock." "Yeah, it's gotten pretty crazy. Look, I just want you to know I never asked to use your dock. Karen came to me and said the HOA was opening up waterfront access to more residents and would I be interested. I said sure, but I had no idea it was your private dock. I thought she meant they were building something new. I felt some of my anger deflate. I appreciate you telling me that. Karen's been telling people you're hoarding community resources and refusing to share. She's painting you as some kind of villain, but everyone knows she's just power-hungry. Last month she tried to fine the Patel family for having the wrong shade of shutters on their house. Wrong shade. Like anyone cares. Did they pay the fine? They repainted the shutters. It was easier than fighting. But this thing with your dock, this is different. You actually own it. She can't just take it. Word was getting around the development. That evening, my neighbor to the east, Frank Morrison, knocked on my door holding a beer. "Thought you might need this," he said, handing it to me. "I heard what Karen's doing. It's complete garbage. My lot goes to the water too, and if she tried to claim my dock, I'd lose my mind." "She might," I warned. "If she's willing to do this to me, she might try it with other waterfront owners." Frank's expression darkened. "Then maybe we need to band together. There are 12 waterfront properties in this development. If she's going after you, she could go after any of us. That's not a bad idea." Strength in numbers. We spent the next hour calling the other waterfront property owners. By Sunday afternoon, 9 of them had agreed to meet at my house Monday evening after my court hearing. Everyone was suddenly very interested in making sure their property rights were protected. Monday morning arrived cold and gray. David met me at the courthouse at 8:30, both of us dressed in suits. Karen showed up with the HOA's lawyer, a sharp-looking woman named Victoria Ross from a firm in Birmingham. The hearing was in front of Judge Raymond Thornton, a man in his 60s with a reputation for no-nonsense rulings. David presented our case clearly. The deed, the survey, the development plans, the photos of the trespassing, the police reports, everything. He argued that the HOA had engaged in a pattern of harassment and illegal activity, and that I needed protection while the matter was resolved. Victoria Ross argued that the HOA had legitimate concerns about property usage within the development, and that disputes over property boundaries were common and should be resolved through arbitration, not restraining orders. Judge Thornton looked skeptical. "Miss Ross, I'm looking at a property deed that very clearly shows the dock in question is on Mr. Anderson's property. What documentation does the HOA have to support their claim?" "Your Honor, the HOA bylaws state that waterfront areas are subject to community oversight." Oversight is not the same as ownership. Does the HOA have a deed, a title, or any legal documentation showing they own this dock? "No, Your Honor, but then this seems pretty straightforward to me." He turned to Karen, who was sitting behind Victoria Ross. "Madam, did you place a lock on Mr. Anderson's dock?" Karen stood up. "Yes, Your Honor. The HOA has a responsibility to manage community resources. It's not a community resource if it's on his private property. Did you have his permission to place that lock?" "I didn't think I needed permission for community property." "But it's not community property. That's the issue." Judge Thornton shook his head. "I'm granting the temporary restraining order. Miss Caldwell, Miss Davis, and Miss Newman, you are not to go onto Mr. Anderson's property, including the dock, without his express permission. You are not to place any locks, signs, or barriers on his property. You are not to fine him or take any punitive action related to this dock. This order is effective immediately and will remain in place until a full hearing can be scheduled. That hearing will be set for." He consulted with his clerk. March 15th. Both parties should be prepared to present complete documentation of their claims. It was a victory, but only a temporary one. As we left the courtroom, Karen glared at me with pure hatred. "This isn't over," she hissed as she passed. "No, it's not," I agreed, "but you're going to lose." That evening, the waterfront property owners gathered in my living room. Frank Morrison was there, along with Susan and Tom Parker, Jennifer Wu, Dave and Linda Crawford, Paul Richardson, Andrea Schmidt, and Rick and Tammy Foster. Everyone was angry and worried. "If she did this to you, what's to stop her from doing it to us?" Jennifer asked. She owned a beautiful property 3 houses down from mine with a dock that could accommodate a decent-sized yacht. "Nothing," I said honestly. "That's why we need to be proactive. I'm going to sue the HOA for harassment, trespassing, and attorney's fees. But more than that, I think we need to vote Karen out and restructure the board." "How do we do that?" Paul asked. Frank pulled out a copy of the HOA bylaws, which he had printed from the community website. "According to this, any resident can call for a special election if they get signatures from 25% of the homeowners. There are 84 homes in Lakeside Estates, so we'd need 21 signatures." "That's doable," Dave said, "especially once people hear what Karen's been doing." We divided up the neighborhood into sections and agreed to start collecting signatures that week. We also decided to put together an information packet for residents, explaining what had happened with my dock and the implications for everyone's property rights. The next few days were busy. During the day, I worked my normal job as a civil engineer at a firm in Montgomery. In the evenings and on my lunch breaks, I knocked on doors and talked to neighbors. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Most people were fed up with Karen's heavy-handed tactics and jumped at the chance to sign the petition. On Wednesday evening, I got a call from David. "You're not going to believe this," he said. "The HOA just filed a counterclaim against you." "For what?" "Unauthorized construction, violation of community standards, and creating a hostile environment for other residents. They're asking for $50,000 in damages and demanding the dock be removed." I sat down heavily. "They're claiming I built my dock without authorization." "Yep. Even though you have all the permits from the county, they're saying you needed HOA approval and didn't get it." "I bought the house with the dock already on it. The previous owner built it." There was a pause. "What?" "Robert Chen, the previous owner, built the dock about 6 years ago. I've just maintained it." "Do you have documentation of when it was built?" "I can get it from the county. The permits should be on file." "Get that to me as soon as possible. If you didn't build the dock, you can't be liable for unauthorized construction." This counterclaim is falling apart already. I drove to the county office the next morning before work and requested all permits associated with my property address. The clerk, a friendly woman named Ruth, printed out a stack of papers dating back 15 years. There it was. A dock construction permit issued to Robert Chen in March 2019, along with all the required inspections and approvals. I paid for certified copies and drove them straight to David's office. By Friday, we had 37 signatures on the petition for a special election, well over the required 25%. Frank submitted it to the HOA board via certified mail, copying all the board members and the HOA's attorney. That night, Karen called me. Her voice was shaking with rage. "You think you can just overthrow the board because you don't like following rules?" she demanded. "I think residents have the right to vote out a board that abuses its power and violates property rights," I replied calmly. "I have done nothing but try to maintain property values and community standards. You trespassed on my property, locked my dock, filed a fraudulent claim about unauthorized construction, and tried to steal my assets. That's not maintaining standards, Karen. That's harassment and possibly criminal activity." "You'll regret this," she said. "I have friends on the zoning board. I can make your life very difficult. Are you threatening me?" She hung up. I immediately called David and recounted the conversation. He sighed deeply. "Save that call log. If she does try to use her connections to cause problems, that's retaliation and possibly corruption. We can use it." The special election was scheduled for 3 weeks later in accordance with HOA bylaws. Karen tried to fight it, claiming some of the signatures were invalid, but Frank had been meticulous. Every signature was from a property owner, every form was correctly filled out. The election would proceed. In the meantime, the harassment continued. Someone kept leaving passive-aggressive notes on my car. My trash cans mysteriously went missing twice. I got a citation from the HOA for my grass being a quarter-inch too long, even though I had just mowed it. Each incident was documented, photographed, and added to our legal file. The full hearing for the restraining order was scheduled for March 15th, but the special election would happen first, on March 8th. We had 3 weeks to campaign, and the Waterfront Coalition took it seriously. We created a slate of candidates to replace Karen, Margaret, and Patricia. Frank Morrison for president, Jennifer Wu for vice president, and Paul Richardson for treasurer. We put together a platform focused on reasonable regulations, respecting property rights and transparent governance. Karen's side fought back hard. She sent out multiple emails to all residents claiming we were trying to destroy the HOA and leave the neighborhood unprotected from bad actors. She held an emergency meeting where she warned that without strong HOA enforcement, property values would plummet. She even implied that I was some kind of troublemaker who had moved to the neighborhood specifically to cause problems, but her tactics backfired. The more she attacked, the more residents came to our side. People were tired of being bullied. The breaking point came when Karen sent out a letter threatening to fine anyone who displayed campaign signs for the opposition candidates. It was such a blatant violation of free speech that even her supporters were taken aback. Tom Parker, a retired attorney who lived on the west side of the development, wrote a scathing response that he distributed to everyone. He pointed out that HOAs were legally required to allow political speech within the community, and that Karen's threat was not only unenforceable but potentially exposed the HOA to legal liability. He endorsed our slate of candidates and encouraged everyone to vote for change. The tide was turning. 3 days before the election, I got a call from Officer Rodriguez. "Mr. Anderson, I wanted to give you a heads up. We've opened an investigation into possible vandalism and harassment related to your ongoing dispute with the HOA. What prompted that? Your police reports. Plus, we've received complaints from several other residents about similar incidents. There's a pattern emerging. We've also been contacted by the county attorney's office about potential corruption issues related to the HOA president using her position to influence zoning decisions." I remembered Karen's threat about having friends on the zoning board. Did she actually try something? "I can't discuss an ongoing investigation, but let's just say someone filed a complaint about her making inappropriate phone calls. It's being looked into." This was getting bigger than I had anticipated. What had started as a property dispute was uncovering a whole web of HOA abuse and potential corruption. Election day arrived warm and sunny. Voting was held at the community clubhouse from noon to 8 p.m. Turnout was heavy, with over 70 of the 84 households casting ballots. Frank, Jennifer, Paul, and I stood outside the clubhouse for most of the day, thanking people for coming and answering last-minute questions. Karen showed up around 7 p.m., flanked by Margaret and Patricia. She looked haggard, her usually perfect appearance somewhat disheveled. She glared at us but didn't say anything, just went inside to vote. The ballots were counted by a neutral third party, an accounting firm Frank had hired to ensure transparency. At 9 p.m., the results were announced. Frank Morrison had won the presidency with 62 votes to Karen's 22. Jennifer Wu had won vice president with 58 votes. Paul Richardson had won treasurer with 55 votes. It was a landslide. Karen stood in the back of the clubhouse, her face red, her hands clenched. When the results were officially announced, she walked out without a word. Margaret and Patricia followed her, both looking shell-shocked. The room erupted in cheers and applause. Frank gave a short speech about moving forward together, respecting property rights, and making Lakeside Estates a community people were proud to live in. It was a good moment, a victory for common sense and fairness, but the legal battle wasn't over yet. The March 15th hearing was still coming, and Karen still had 7 days left as HOA president. I wasn't naive enough to think she'd go quietly. I was right. The next morning, I woke up to find that someone had dumped a truckload of gravel across my driveway during the night, completely blocking my access to the street. It must have been done around 3 or 4 a.m. because my neighbors hadn't heard anything. The gravel was piled 3 feet high and extended the entire width of my driveway. I took photos, then called the police again. A different officer came out this time, a veteran cop named Sergeant Mike Dawson. He surveyed the gravel pile and shook his head. "This is harassment, plain and simple. Any idea who's responsible? I have suspicions, but no proof. The recently voted out HOA president? That would be my guess." He wrote up a report and advised me to install security cameras if I didn't have them already. I called a landscaping company to remove the gravel, which cost me $700 on an emergency basis. That afternoon, I installed a complete camera system around my house. Front door, back door, driveway, and one pointed at the dock. If Karen or anyone else tried anything again, I'd have video evidence. Frank called an emergency board meeting for that evening to begin the transition. According to the bylaws, the new board members would officially take office in 3 days, but Frank wanted to get ahead of any last-minute sabotage. The outgoing board was required to turn over all financial records, passwords, vendor contacts, and legal documents. The meeting was tense. Karen showed up with Victoria Ross, her attorney. Frank had Tom Parker there as legal counsel for the new board. About 30 residents attended to observe. "We need access to all HOA accounts and records," Frank said formally. "You'll get them when your term officially begins," Karen replied coldly. Tom Parker leaned forward. "Miss Caldwell, the bylaws require a complete transition within 72 hours of election results. Refusing to cooperate is a violation of your fiduciary duty as outgoing president. I need time to organize the documents. You've had 12 hours since the election. How much organization do you need?" They stared at each other. Finally, Victoria Ross whispered something to Karen, who looked furious but nodded. "Fine. I'll provide access to the financial accounts tomorrow. The physical documents are in storage and will take longer to retrieve." "Where are they stored?" Frank asked. "In a climate-controlled facility in Birmingham. We'll need the address and access information." Karen's jaw tightened, but she wrote down the information on a piece of paper and slid it across the table. The meeting continued with discussions of ongoing HOA business, landscaping contracts, pool maintenance, and several pending violations notices. When they got to my case, Karen tried one last power play. "There's still the matter of Mr. Anderson's dock violations. The HOA has filed a counterclaim that needs to be resolved." Frank looked at her steadily. That case is between you personally and Mr. Anderson. You filed it as outgoing president, but the new board isn't obligated to continue it. In fact, I move that we immediately drop all claims related to the dock and issue a formal apology to Mr. Anderson for the harassment he's endured. Jennifer seconded the motion. The 3 new board members voted yes. Karen, Margaret, and Patricia voted no. The motion carried. Karen stood up abruptly. This board is making a terrible mistake. You're setting a precedent that residents can do whatever they want without HOA oversight. We're setting a precedent that property rights matter, Frank corrected. If it's on someone's deeded property, the HOA doesn't have authority over it. That's not complicated. Karen grabbed her papers and walked out, Victoria Ross hurrying after her. Margaret and Patricia stayed long enough to turn over their files, both of them looking relieved to be done with the whole situation. After they left, Frank turned to me. We'll file a motion to dismiss the counterclaim tomorrow. It should be straightforward since we're the plaintiffs on the original claim. What about the hearing on the 15th? We might not need it now. If we drop the counterclaim and issue a formal apology, that could resolve everything. But I'd recommend keeping the hearing just to get a final ruling on the property boundaries. That way there's no question going forward. It made sense. I wanted this completely settled, not just papered over. The next day, Frank, Jennifer, and Paul went to the bank to get access to the HOA accounts. What they found was alarming. Over the past 2 years, Karen had spent nearly $80,000 in HOA funds on legal fees for various enforcement actions against residents. She had also paid herself a management fee of $1,500 a month, which was not authorized by the bylaws. The HOA was supposed to be entirely volunteer-run. Frank called an emergency meeting of the new board and several key residents, including me. We sat in his living room, reviewing bank statements and invoices. "This is embezzlement," Tom Parker said flatly. "She's been paying herself without authorization and spending HOA funds on personal vendettas. You need to report this to the police immediately." "How much are we talking total?" Jennifer asked. Frank did some quick calculations. Between the unauthorized salary and questionable legal expenses, probably close to $100,000 over 2 years. The room was silent. This had gone way beyond a property dispute. Karen had been systematically looting the HOA. "What about the storage facility?" Paul asked. "Did anyone go check out those documents she mentioned?" "I went this morning," Frank said. "The unit doesn't exist. The address she gave me is a shopping center. There's no storage facility there." So she lied about having the documents. Either that or they're somewhere else entirely. Either way, she's obstructing the transition. Tom pulled out his phone. "I'm calling the police. This needs to be investigated properly." Detective Sarah Kim from the Financial Crimes Unit came out the next day to interview Frank and review the documents. She was a sharp woman in her early 40s who specialized in white-collar crime. She spent 3 hours going through the bank statements and asking questions. "Has Miss Caldwell provided any explanation for these payments?" she asked. "She claims the management fee was approved by the previous board, but there's no record of that in any meeting minutes," Frank explained. "And the legal fees were all for cases against residents, not for the HOA's benefit." "What about the current legal action against Mr. Anderson?" "We're dropping that. The new board doesn't support it." Detective Kim looked at me. "Mr. Anderson, I understand you have documentation of harassment and trespassing." I provided her with copies of everything: the police reports, the photos, the recordings of threatening phone calls, the gravel incident, everything. She took notes and copies of all the documents. I'll be opening a formal investigation into possible embezzlement and harassment. Miss Caldwell will be contacted for an interview. In the meantime, if any of you experience further harassment or threats, call 911 immediately. Don't wait. The investigation moved quickly. Karen was interviewed and, according to Detective Kim, became defensive and hostile. She claimed the management fee was legitimate and that all legal expenses were necessary to maintain community standards. When asked about the trespassing and property damage, she denied everything, but the evidence was piling up. My new security cameras caught Karen driving past my house multiple times late at night. One of my neighbors reported seeing her taking photos of other waterfront properties at odd hours. The gravel company that delivered the pile to my driveway identified Karen's credit card from the receipt. She had paid cash but used her card to reserve the delivery time. On March 12th, 3 days before the scheduled court hearing, Karen was arrested at her home and charged with embezzlement, trespassing, harassment, and criminal mischief. The news spread through Lakeside Estates like wildfire. Residents were shocked, though many said they weren't entirely surprised given her behavior. Margaret and Patricia both cooperated with the investigation and weren't charged with anything. It became clear they had been largely ignorant of Karen's financial improprieties and had mainly gone along with her decisions to avoid conflict. The March 15th hearing went forward, but with a very different dynamic. David presented our case, including the new board's formal withdrawal of the counterclaim and their written apology to me. Victoria Ross appeared on behalf of Karen personally, but it was clear her heart wasn't in it. Her client was facing criminal charges, and the civil case was falling apart. Judge Thornton reviewed all the documentation, including the original deed, the survey, the development plans, and the county permits from 2019. "I'm making this ruling permanent," he said. The dock, located at 847 Shoreline Drive, is the private property of Mr. Yates Anderson, as clearly shown by the property deed and survey. The HOA has no claim to it, no authority over it, and no right to access it without Mr. Anderson's permission. Furthermore, I'm awarding Mr. Anderson attorney's fees and costs in the amount of. He consulted with David briefly, $18,500, to be paid by Karen Caldwell personally, not by the HOA. It was a complete victory. Karen would have to pay my legal fees out of her own pocket, and the property boundaries were settled once and for all. As we left the courtroom, Victoria Ross approached David. "For what it's worth, I advised her to drop this weeks ago," she said quietly. "She wouldn't listen. She was convinced she could win through sheer force of will." "That seems to be her approach to everything," David replied. Karen's criminal trial was scheduled for June. In the meantime, she was out on bail, but she had moved out of Lakeside Estates. Her house went up for sale in April, listed at a price that suggested she needed money quickly. Life in the neighborhood gradually returned to normal. Frank, Jennifer, and Paul proved to be excellent board members, focused on actual community needs rather than petty enforcement. They revised the bylaws to include stronger protections for property rights and more transparency in financial matters. They also established term limits and regular financial audits to prevent future abuse. The HOA filed a civil suit against Karen to recover the embezzled funds. She settled out of court for $60,000, which she paid through the sale of her house and her retirement account. She also agreed to never serve on an HOA board again, though that was largely symbolic since she was about to be a convicted felon. I spent the spring fixing up my dock, which had suffered some wear and tear during the whole ordeal. I replaced some boards, repainted the railings, and installed better lighting. It felt good to work on it without looking over my shoulder for HOA board members with clipboards. Frank stopped by one Saturday while I was working. "Looks great," he said, admiring the fresh paint. "Thanks. It's nice to be able to enjoy it without worrying about being fined." "I owe you an apology, by the way." I looked at him in surprise. "For what?" "For not standing up to Karen sooner. A lot of us knew she was out of control, but we just kept our heads down and hoped it wouldn't affect us. You forced the issue and it benefited everyone." "I didn't have much choice. She was trying to steal my property." "Still, it took courage. And it exposed a lot of problems that needed to be fixed." We stood there for a moment, looking out at the lake. It was a beautiful day, warm but not too humid, with a light breeze rippling the water. "You know what the ironic thing is?" I said. "If Karen had just left me alone, none of this would have happened. She'd still be HOA president, still be taking her little management fee, still be running the show. Her ego got in the way. She couldn't stand that someone might have something other residents didn't have, even if they legitimately owned it." "It's the HOA mentality," I said. "Everything has to be equal, everything has to be controlled, but that's not how property rights work. I paid for this dock, I maintain it. It's mine. And nobody's going to dispute that again," Frank assured me. The trial in June was fairly quick. Karen's attorney negotiated a plea deal, guilty to embezzlement and harassment with charges of trespassing and criminal mischief dropped. She was sentenced to 18 months in prison, with the possibility of parole after 9 months and 3 years of probation. She was also ordered to pay restitution to the HOA and to me for the property damage. I attended the sentencing hearing. Karen looked diminished in her orange jumpsuit, her perfect hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, no makeup. When given a chance to speak, she gave a brief apology that sounded rehearsed and insincere. Judge Melissa Winters, who presided over the criminal case, was unimpressed. "Miss Caldwell, you held a position of trust within your community, and you abused that trust repeatedly and flagrantly," the judge said. "You embezzled funds, harassed residents, damaged property, and lied to investigators. The sentence reflects the seriousness of your actions and the need to deter others who might think HOA board membership gives them unlimited power." As Karen was led away, I felt not triumph but a kind of weary relief. It was over. Finally, completely over. That summer was one of the best I could remember. I spent my weekends on the lake, fishing from my dock, taking the boat out with friends, hosting barbecues. The Lakeside Estates community thrived under the new board leadership. Property values actually increased, partly because word got out that the neighborhood had cleaned up its HOA problems. Several of the other waterfront owners upgraded their docks, knowing they wouldn't face harassment or bogus claims. Jennifer Wu built a beautiful boathouse that became something of a showpiece. Paul Richardson added a swim platform. The waterfront became more active and vibrant than it had been in years. One evening in late July, I was sitting on my dock with a beer, watching the sunset when my phone rang. It was David. "I'm calling with good news," he said. "Karen's restitution check cleared. You've been paid in full for the legal fees and property damage." "That's great. Thanks for handling everything, David." "My pleasure. It's not often I get such a clear-cut case. Usually these HOA disputes are much murkier. Any word on how she's doing in prison?" "I heard through the grapevine she's not adjusting well. Turns out people in prison don't respond well to being bossed around by a former HOA president." I couldn't help but laugh. There was a certain poetic justice to it. After we hung up, I sat there thinking about everything that had happened. It had been a stressful, expensive, time-consuming ordeal, but it had been worth it. I had defended my property rights, exposed corruption, and helped reform a broken system. The neighborhood was better for it. More importantly, I had learned something about standing up for yourself. It would have been easier to just give in, to let Karen have access to the dock to avoid the conflict. Most people would have done that, but sometimes easy isn't right. Sometimes you have to fight, even when it's hard, even when it costs you, because principles matter. I looked out at the dock, at the boat gently rocking in the evening breeze, at the water reflecting the orange and pink of the sunset. This was mine. I had the deed to prove it. And nobody, not Karen Caldwell, not any future HOA president, not anyone, could take it away from me. My phone buzzed with a text from Frank. Board meeting next week. Just routine stuff. Wanna come observe? Free coffee and donuts. I smiled and texted back, I'll be there. The new board had restored my faith in the HOA system, or at least shown that it could work when run by reasonable people. They weren't perfect, but they were honest and fair, and that was all anyone could ask for. As darkness fell, I turned on the new dock lights I had installed. They cast a warm glow across the water, illuminating the private property sign I had put back up. This time it stayed up. No chains, no locks, no harassment. I raised my beer bottle in a silent toast to property rights, to standing firm, to winning against the odds. Then I finished the beer, gathered my fishing gear, and headed back to the house. Life in Lakeside Estates had returned to normal, but it was a better normal. The community had learned some hard lessons about power, accountability, and respecting boundaries. And I had my dock, free and clear, exactly as it should be. The story could have ended there, but there was an epilogue of sorts that happened a few months later. I was at a local hardware store in Montgomery, picking up some materials for a small home repair project, when I literally bumped into Victoria Ross, Karen's former attorney, coming around the end of an aisle. "Mr. Anderson," she said, looking surprised but not displeased. "How are you?" "Doing well. How about you?" "Busy as always. I heard things worked out well with the new HOA board." "They did. Frank and his team are doing a great job." She hesitated, then said, "I want you to know I genuinely tried to talk Karen out of pursuing that case, multiple times. But she was absolutely convinced she was right." "I believe you. She seemed like someone who didn't handle being wrong very well." "That's an understatement. In my 20 years practicing law, I've never had a client so resistant to legal advice." She genuinely believed that being HOA president gave her authority over everyone and everything in the neighborhood. "It's a weird power trip," I agreed. "These HOA board positions attract a certain type of person sometimes." The irony is, if she had focused on actual community improvement instead of control and enforcement, she probably would have been a decent president. She had organizational skills and wasn't afraid of hard work. But she couldn't resist the urge to boss people around. Exactly. Victoria shifted her shopping basket to her other hand. "Anyway, I'm glad it worked out for you, and I'm glad the community addressed the systemic issues. That's rare." We parted ways, and I thought about what she had said. Karen Caldwell had had the opportunity to be a positive force in the neighborhood, but she had let power and ego corrupt her. It was a cautionary tale about the importance of checks and balances, even in something as seemingly minor as a homeowners association. By the fall, Karen had been released on parole after serving 9 months. I heard she moved to Tennessee to live with her sister. She was prohibited from returning to Alabama except for official business, which was part of her parole conditions. Her ex-husband, who had divorced her during the trial, still lived in the area but refused to discuss her with anyone. Margaret and Patricia both stayed in Lakeside Estates. Margaret actually apologized to me in person one day when we ran into each other at the community pool. She admitted she had known Karen's behavior was inappropriate, but had been too intimidated to speak up. "I should have said something," she told me, looking genuinely remorseful. "I knew the dock was your property. I knew she was overstepping. But she was so forceful and I didn't want to become her next target." "I understand," I said, and I did. "Not everyone is comfortable with conflict. For what it's worth, I'm glad you fought back. The neighborhood is so much better now." Patricia never apologized, but she did resign from the HOA entirely and kept to herself. Some people deal with their guilt by withdrawing, and I didn't hold it against her. The holidays that year were particularly enjoyable. The HOA organized a community party at the clubhouse, something that hadn't happened in years. Frank and the new board made it clear that the event was purely social. No business would be discussed, no rules would be enforced, just neighbors getting together to celebrate. Over 100 people showed up. There was food, music, and a genuine sense of community that had been missing during Karen's reign. Kids ran around playing, adults chatted and laughed, and for a few hours, everyone forgot about property lines and bylaws and just enjoyed being neighbors. I brought my famous smoked brisket, which disappeared within the first hour. Frank raised a glass to toast the community and thanked everyone for their patience during the transition. "We've been through a rough patch," he said, "but we came out stronger. Here's to a great neighborhood and even better neighbors." Everyone cheered. Looking around the room, I saw Tom and Susan Parker, Jennifer Wu, Dave and Linda Crawford, Paul Richardson, Andrea Schmidt, Rick and Tammy Foster, and dozens of others. These were good people who just wanted to live their lives without unnecessary drama or intrusion. As the party wound down, I found myself talking with Ben Henderson, the guy who had initially been told he could use my dock. "No hard feelings about that whole thing, right?" he asked, slightly nervous. "None at all. You didn't know what was going on." I felt terrible when I found out the truth. Karen made it sound like you were being unreasonable and selfish. She was good at manipulating the narrative, but the facts told a different story. "Well, I'm glad it worked out. And hey, if you ever want company while fishing, I'd love to join you sometime. I'll bring my own gear and beer." "I'd like that," I said, and I meant it. In the end, the whole ordeal had some unexpected positive outcomes. The community was stronger, the HOA was functioning properly, and I had made some genuine friendships with neighbors I might not have gotten to know otherwise. The dock remained mine, undisputed and secure, a testament to the importance of standing up for your rights. I spent New Year's Eve on that dock, watching fireworks reflect off the water, surrounded by friends. It was a perfect ending to a turbulent year and a perfect beginning to what promised to be a much calmer one. The deed sat in my filing cabinet, proof of ownership, proof that I had been right all along. But more than that, it was a reminder that documents matter, that property rights are fundamental, and that sometimes you have to fight for what's yours, even when it would be easier to walk away. Karen Caldwell had tried to claim my boat dock as community property. The deed proved I owned it, and in the end, not only did I keep my dock, but I helped ban the corrupt leadership that had plagued our neighborhood. It was a complete victory, hard won but absolutely worth it. As I stood on my dock that night, watching the last of the fireworks fade from the sky, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Justice had been served, both legally and morally. The neighborhood had learned valuable lessons about governance and accountability. And my property rights were secure, backed by law and confirmed by the courts. The lake was calm. The night was peaceful, and my dock remained exactly where it belonged, firmly on my property under my control, mine in every legal and practical sense. And that, ultimately, was all that mattered.